Welcome everyone to Why Does This Even Matter Tuesday. Today we are having our recap after almost 2 weeks of how things have been going down in Mythic Plus and in the Raid in Season 4. Yes, of course, the participation of this season is getting lower and lower as the season already was quite the relaxed and laid back one. On top of that, a few weeks ago we had the release of WoW Remix, drawing more players away from the season, and in a couple of days we are also getting the release of the beta of the War Within, which will further draw players away from this season. However, it's still relevant to check how things have been going because it will help be able to give an idea of what you might want to see change, fixed, adjusted, buffed or nerfed for the next expansion. Because in just a couple of days, you will be able, for example, to run your class and spec in a dungeon in Dragonflight and then log out and then log back in and run in a dungeon in the War Within with your, so to speak, new version of the spec to see what has changed, to see what is different, what has improved or what is worse. So continuing to play in this season is still quite helpful to be able to give some input and some insight on what you might want to see change for your favorite spec in the next expansion. Now, looking at Mythic Plus first in terms of damage, there aren't that many surprises as usual. There are still a few, though. For starters, this is the first time in what feels like forever, even since the start of this season, the first time in forever that Red Paladin doesn't make the top 3 for now, it looks like in this week. Ever since their multiple buffs and their acquisition of their legendary in Season 3, they have been permanently in top 3 spots. Now they have been slowly going down. Surprisingly, Marksmanship has still kept up their performance in Mythic Plus over the weeks in this season. What is perhaps more surprising in terms of damage output in Mythic Plus is the terrible state of rogues right now. You know, it definitely wasn't nearly as bad at the beginning of the season, at the very least for one of them. You know, at the very least you had one spec, you had Outlaw doing somewhat okay, but now not even Outlaw is cutting it. Now all 3 rogue specs are in the bottom 10 of performers in Mythic Plus. What might also be surprising, to be honest, is Havoc, which has usually also been a habitual presence around this level of performance. Now it's much lower down. But what might be more relevant than just the damage performance of the specs and the few outliers we have known for a while already is the meta, right? Because not all of these numbers are created equal. Some of these might be looking terrible, but they are still quite good going into the next expansion. What do I mean, for example, is take the healers, right? Now, these numbers look bad. They look bad because Restoration Druid is heavily dominating the season. However, what is special about this is that, for example, Resto Druid hasn't even changed a tier set from Season 3. It's the exact same spec, so why is it dominating now? The only reason why Resto Druid is doing this well is because Red Paladin has lost out in the meta. You have lost your combatress in your group and you need a combatress from your healer. That's the only reason why Resto Druid is this high. It's definitely not a weak spec, but it's not that much stronger than Resto Shaman or even Preservation Evoker, definitely not Mistweaver, even the 2 priest specs. The only reason why it grew this much is because now you need a combatress in your group. So it doesn't look nearly as bad going into the next expansion because this doesn't mean the other healers are much weaker. And also this doesn't mean it will repeat itself in the War Within as long as you have a single DPS with a combatress being viable in the next season. Or even, of course, a tank with a combatress. Now this of course becomes a problem instead when you look at the tanks, because this number is much worse than the healer number. And that's because this doesn't have anything to do with having or not having a major raid buff or a major requirement for your party. This has to do with the utility of Vengeance Demon Hunter in Mythic Plus keys because of their multiple sigils and multiple AoE stops, whether it is double chains, double fear, double silence or AoE stun. This is just too much right now to compete with for the other tanks, especially in an expansion where Blizzard definitely spiked up the number of casts required to be stopped in a key. Either casts that can be interrupted or silenced, or casts that cannot and need to be crowd controlled some other way. Disorients, stuns, knockups, etc, etc. And that's what is relevant to look for as soon as we start, for example, the beta, to see if this is likely to continue in the next season. How are the dungeons in the next expansion tuned and designed to see if the power level, the utility power level of Vengeance will continue in the next season. That is going to be one of the more worrying parts of the tuning and the balancing of the next expansion, trying to do something about this current dominance of Vengeance, which is the highest we have ever seen for any other tank. Even the Exodia days of Guardian, they barely got past 90% for a few weeks. Instead, now we have a stable 94% average for over a month of Vengeance. Even if we were to go back to prior expansions, nothing even comes close to the level of dominance of Vengeance. So that's the main issue we can see already for the next expansion in terms of problems when it comes to Mythic Plus, taking a good look at the state of Vengeance. But then, however, we have another problem. I know, we are filled with problems today, and that's the DPS comp. Because, fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, we have a problem. Because these colors, I have seen them before. White, teal, and dark green, I have seen these colors before. In fact, I have seen them a few months ago. Yeah, what a surprise, these are the same 3 specs that were part of the Exodia composition in Season 2. Whoa, what are the odds that the exact same 3 specs make the top comp in this season as well? This is not a good indicator for the next expansion. The fact that even after approximately 74 sets of nerfs for augmentation, they went quiet for about 3 months at the end of Season 3, and then they just went back up to where they were before. Even back here, players were saying, you know what, Shadow Priest isn't even that strong. It's just that Mass Dispel is so required in Season 2, it's just that Mind Soothe is so good in Season 2, that's why they're making it in here. So they went silent for a couple of months at the beginning of Season 3, they started rising again, and by the time the Fated Season began, they were already front and center in the meta of the DPS. And then, no point even talking about Mage. Mage is like contractually obligated by Blizzard to be meta at any given point in any expansion, so this is not a surprise. It's a problem. It's a problem going into the next expansion because we have now seen this happen twice in a row in 2 different seasons. Even worse, it has been happening with another season in the middle, which means multiple nerfs, and multiple nerfs were not even enough to stop this. It happened again. It came back with a vengeance in this season. So it is giving us reasons to be worried for the next expansion and reasons to be on high alert as soon as the beta launches, to go in and start checking the state, for example, of these specs and see how they are planning to operate in the next expansion. Of course, the hardest one to gauge will, as usual, be augmentation because of their unique spot of being a support buff spec as a DPS. It's gonna create the usual problem of in high kill levels, they give you the best chance to survive, to stay alive, to not die to mechanics, which tends to be the hardest part of high keys, more so than squeezing as much damage as you can. So it's a hard spot for Blizzard to crawl themselves out of right now. Now, things are not nearly as terrible for the rest of the DPS, which can, go back and forth more based on their balancing, less so than what they bring to the group in terms of buffs or debuffs. Sometimes it's Ret, sometimes it's Havoc, maybe for the whole season is Rogue. Even before then, it could have been another spec like, Destro, Enhancement, Balanced Druid. So that's more to do with the balance of the spec itself and less about, the thing they bring or the problems it might still have in the next expansion. It's more about tuning, right? Same can be said for the Raid. We can't really look at the Raid right now and see some major problems that might be carried over in the next expansion. We do have, to be fair, some unique results, because this is, for example, Mythic Amirjasil in Awakened, and this is Mythic Aberus in Awakened. You can see the colors are rather similar. In fact, I believe the top 6 actually is the exact same in 2 different weeks in 2 different raids. So it's already, an idea of what's doing well right now, but definitely not something that you can say, oh, it's gonna be a problem in the next expansion. This spec is going to also be some best in slot raid spot for the next expansion. Much of this will be due to balancing. After all, Assassination himself, who is currently topping 2 of the raids, in the 3rd one they are more average, but 2 out of 3 of the raids are topped by Assassination, who just happened to be buffed recently. Before then, Assassination was at the absolute bottom. Even before the beginning of the Awakened season, in actual Season 3, Assassination wasn't doing nearly as well compared to what it's doing now. So this is more about the balancing of the specs in the raid. Generally speaking, where we can find more problems based on what each spec is bringing tends to be Mythic Plus. The raid usually doesn't have problems about slotting the Bloodlust, having a spec make it in because of Bloodlust, or having a spec make it in because of combat threats, or having a spec be dominant because of the massive utility. That doesn't happen nearly as often in raid environments. There are definitely some repeat offenders. Okay, let's not pretend that raid is all about balancing and tuning, because if it happens once or twice, okay, it's about balancing. If it's for one season, demo is very good, and then the season after, devastation is very good, then okay, that's balancing. But if for 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 seasons Feral is terrible, or Frost Decay is bad, or Marksmanship Hunter is poor, or Elemental Shaman can't break the top 5 in years, then that might start to be, kind of like a problematic trend of certain specs not quite being able to have a good enough damage profile, perhaps, to be very competitive in the raid. Because some of these specs you might have seen already at the top. Many of you certainly have seen specs like Shadow Priest be towards the top of the damage. Even Devastation, released in Season 1 but in Season 2 in Aberrus, was doing quite well. Red Paladin in the past few seasons have been doing quite well. Arms has routinely reached the top rankings quite often as a DPS spec. At least one of the rogue specs is a habitual presence in the top third of the results. So there are some specs that tend to perform better than others overall. Of course, I haven't mentioned mages, who usually are always there. Even Havoc Demon Hunter, generally speaking, is in the top half of the results. So there are still some specs, even if we say most of the results in the raid are due to tuning and can change season by season, there are definitely some specs that tend to change more positively than others, even in the raid. As I said, not to the extreme levels of Mythic Plus, where certain specs never quite seem to catch a break, like, this expansion, even the past one, DKs, for example, right? DK specs, or the usual, since forever, Feral Druids, for example. These don't seem to break it in the meta, in what feels like forever. But that also does tend to happen in the raid. We could also mention the healing, but we have been more positive towards the healing in this season because of how even the specs have been. If we check by HPS, for example, as you can see here, the gap is about 7% between these 6 specs. In Aberrus, the gap between the top and this one is actually 2%, and then in Vault of the Incarnates, the gap is about 8% again. The outlier tends to be Holy Paladin, which has been actually buffed in this reset, so it should be improving slightly to match the other specs overall. So it's not nearly as big of a problem when it comes to healers. We're not really seeing any major issues going into the next expansion when it comes to the meta of healers, like we might have seen in the past. Like, for example, the way Discipline Priest puts Absorb Shields on the party to be the first one to get the healing done, and their major cooldown big burst healing is a big issue. We are not really having that right now for healers when it comes to the raid. So it is a much more even and a much more balanced situation when it comes to what we can look forward to in the next expansion, much like what we said about the healers in Mythic Plus. Even though it looks not nearly as good right now, it is still not entirely because of how dominant Resto Druid is, and more because of how well it fits with the comp. I can guarantee you 114%, according to my studies, that if, for example, Shadow, Ret, and Rogue were the main combo of DPS in the season, then the meta healer would have been Resto Shaman, not Resto Druid. And not because Resto Shaman is much better than Resto Druid, but just because you needed a Bloodlust, for example. So this is what we have right now in this updated review of the state of the meta in Season 4. Less so to check the actual meta of Season 4, or because we care about the meta in Season 4 right now, but more so to try to see if the meta right now is giving us some indications of possible problems going into the next expansion, given that we are having the beta come out in a couple of days. As we mentioned, problems around the power of the tank in Mythic Plus, problem about the composition of the DPS revolving around, unfortunately, Augmentation Evoker, for example. Those are some things we might want to keep an eye out on as we get into the beta and start testing the specs for the next expansion, hoping that Blizzard will find eventually some fixes for these specs to give the players more choice, more variety, and more options in the next expansion. So for today, on this Tuesday, we are done with this recap. We can now leave each other as I have to go out and shop for my groceries. So we're starting the goodbyes, leaving my desk to get changed. Thanks, of course, as usual, for the usual supporters through Patreon, and also to everyone who is doing it for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, Okay, we're almost done. It's time to go out. Hopefully I will take less than my usual hour I waste outside.